Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker. Today we're pleased to have with us Catherine Blunt. Catherine, thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you briefly introduce yourself? What are you doing currently? What keeps you busy? And maybe a little bit on your background?
Sure. I cover power and utilities for the Wall Street Journal. My coverage, my remit is national, but I often cover issues in the West, including many of the wildfire issues we're seeing now. I've been doing this for about 5 years, and a lot of my earlier work focused on PG&E. And I wrote a book about the many issues that converged to create such a challenging set of circumstances for that company. That came out almost a year ago exactly. It's called California Burning.
I am holding the book. Thank you for putting all the effort into writing such a thorough endeavor. What made you decide to jump into something so significant? That's no small feat.
Well, it wasn't necessarily, well, I suppose in terms of overall coverage of PG&E, it wasn't necessarily a choice that I had per se. I started in this role at the Journal on November 5th, 2018, and the campfire ignited 3 days later. So it became very clear within a matter of weeks that this would be a critical focus for me covering utilities. And I had the great privilege of working with a couple of other reporters who are very talented and knew the utility space better than I did. And we together, did a series of stories that I'm very proud of and proved to be a good foundation for a project like this.
So maybe before we dive into some of the details in the book, you cover a lot that's happening around energy and utility space. Again, maybe you got drawn into it yourself, but what drew you into being so involved on this topic around wildfires?
Well, I think, again, it was having that foundational coverage of PG&E. PG&E has faced so many distinct challenges related to wildfire risk mitigation over the years. And so then having that as the foundation of my expertise has helped to, examine other aspects of this as it relates to other utilities.
So I know a lot of our conversation's going to focus around wildfires, obviously, given your book and given some recent activities. But maybe taking a step back from that a little bit, where do you see the priorities of electric grid operators? Where do you see some of the really active trends in the energy space right now taking shape?
I think whether you're talking about a utility, or an RTO or anything of that nature, certainly there's been a lot of focus on the energy transition and making sure that goes, as smoothly as possible. Balancing the push to reduce carbon emissions with the need to maintain reliability. But I think we're certainly seeing a lot of operational risks emerge, particularly in the West, related to wildfire mitigation that perhaps aren't being addressed as quickly as they need to be, given the kind of the change in the risk profile throughout the region.
Well, let's dive in on the wildfire topic. Each summer, and sometimes outside the summer, with that Boulder fire in December, there seems to be devastating wildfires, and it doesn't seem that many communities that have the urban-rural interface are very immune. What would you say we're starting to understand more about the overlap between grids and wildfire?
Well, I think there's a few things to keep in mind. Certainly, when we're talking about wildfire, power lines are not the number one cause of ignition. There's so many different things that can create, ignite a wildfire. That being said, power lines have been implicated in some of the deadliest and most destructive over the past decade. And it's clear that wildfire risk is increasing, in part because of drought, in part simply because more people have moved into areas at risk of wildfire, making the consequence of that fire potentially greater, whether that's caused by infrastructure failure or not. And so, climate change is definitely an underlying theme here, and more utilities across the West are recognizing the need to do more to make sure that they're taking all the necessary steps, whether that be preventative maintenance or proactive power shutoffs or other things, to make it so that when the conditions get very risky, they've done enough to minimize the chance of their lines playing a role in any significant fire. And but different utilities are moving at different speeds, and it's a little bit hard to predict where the next area of real intense risk is going to be. So it's certainly a challenging set of circumstances.
So I know this is a broad question, and we're going to get into it a little bit later details, but as we jump in, I guess the question would be, are we learning from these major events? And if you would argue that we are, Is there ways that we can institutionalize these lessons and put the practices in place that really allow us to mitigate things at the scale that's required?
I think the short answer is yes. Utilities are absolutely learning from each other. They're doing so actively. Critics of sort of the preparedness or lack thereof of the utilities in this region might say like more could have been done earlier. There's been signs that fire risk is increasing throughout the region. It's been that way for quite some time. San Diego Gas and Electric began grappling with this actively after 2007 fire, right? And the California Public Utilities Commission required more from the Southern California utilities by way of wildfire prep or wildfire risk mitigation. Didn't require the same of PG&E because it didn't appear that PG&E's service territory would be at elevated risk of wildfire in the way that it was, even though signs were emerging that wasn't in fact the case, and it should have been held to the same standard as the Southern California utilities. And then, outside of California, you've seen utilities in Oregon try to observe California's experience, but perhaps didn't move quickly enough on that front, right? And having all the available tools in place to mitigate fire risk. We saw that back in 2020. And now, of course, as we know, Hawaiian Electric is facing criticism for a number of different things related to wildfire risk. There's no official determination of what ignited the fire in Maui, but it looks as though power lines are implicated, and it's faced criticism for everything from moving fairly slowly to put in place a comprehensive plan to address fire risk, as well as not having a plan in place to proactively shut off power when the conditions get riskier, which is not a regulatory requirement, and the utility is not an outlier. But to kind of the original question, it's easy to say in hindsight more should be done, but I think we're probably at a place in which more can be done just because so many different utilities have experience with this at this point. And there could be probably more done to establish what best practice is.
I was maybe going to take it in a different order, but let's jump into what can be done since you're starting to go there. Mitigating the impact of wildfire from communities is a huge undertaking. And so what sort of solutions are you seeing that come up? What does the toolkit look like? What are some of the things that can be put in place that can really be helpful?
Sure. So I think that PG&E has a very interesting suite of solutions that it's trying to employ at this point, and it kind of covers a lot of different ways in which utilities might go about this. I mean, most basically, for one, it's simply establishing good inspections and maintenance practices, right? And not to say that the company's doing that perfectly, but they are trying to do it differently than they have historically. Using technology like drones and other things to evaluate the state of different pieces of hardware and other things. For a while they had a really intense vegetation management approach in place. Just the simple act of trying to keep trees far away from power lines, that's significant. They've since sort of altered their approach to that because they have new technology settings in place, they're relatively new, that make it so that if anything comes in contact with the line, whether that be a tree branch or a squirrel or what have you, it will shut off immediately on contact, which they say reduces ignitions to a greater degree than simply clearing trees. Kind of interesting to think about. And then their long-term plan is to bury 10,000 miles of power lines, basically eliminating fire risk by virtue of putting them underground. And you see, other things another thing that PG&E is doing less of is like covered conductor, simply insulating it so there's something, comes into contact and won't spark. I know throughout the West, other utilities are also using that kind of automatic shut-off setting. There has been some talk elsewhere in California of expanding the number of lines that are going to go underground. And certainly, and I should mention, in California, all the large utility companies have plans in place to proactively de-energize the lines when in periods of risky conditions, usually autumn, when strong winds pick up and make the risk of fire spread very great. Other utilities are trying to solidify plans so that they can effectively do this as needed. Some other utilities have these plans in place, but it's to date pretty much been, not exclusively, but most widely used in California.
Can we talk a little bit about advanced forecasting and integrated planning? I know those are kind of two different topics, but how would you kind of maybe articulate or further define how those tools are being used?
I know in the general sense that is happening. I can't speak well to that particular element of this, but what I can say is that situational awareness is certainly a part of the puzzle, especially when you're planning the public safety power shutoffs. I think, the California utilities sort of tried to pioneer, or at least pioneer, the really expansive use of like weather stations, weather cameras, just general data, probably AI, I would imagine, and just trying to get a much better granular view of the conditions on the ground so that they can make the appropriate choices when it's getting riskier, whether that's turning off the power or taking some other step to try to minimize ignition risk. And one of the challenges in having a successful public safety power shutoff program is that, I mean, you're trying to limit the use of that, right? It comes with, I mean, safety risks are serious, so are reliability risks, right? A lot of critical infrastructure needs electricity, clearly. There's a lot of customers that rely on electricity for medical needs. It's not easy to ask people to be in the dark for any amount of time. So having that situational awareness is critical and being able to effectively limit the scope of what you're doing.
Is there anything you would add on sectionalization or kind of breaking down the grid into smaller bite-sized chunks so you can target?
That's another part of it too.
Solutions?
Absolutely. Yeah. Having sectionalizers so that you can take a more surgical approach to the shutoffs. The one interesting experience that Californians had was in 2019, PG&E implemented a massive PSPS event kind of for the first time, like a really large one. And a lot of people were in the dark for, I think, as long as 4 days. And one of the big criticisms there was it just didn't have the capability to do it in a more surgical way. And so, in the face of risk, it chose safety over reliability, understandably speaking, given the circumstances that it was dealing with. But without the ability to parcel it up, it was just sweeping, and a lot of chaos ensued and economic damages and other things.
Are there any breakthrough or especially innovative efforts that you're excited about? One that comes to mind for me, I know some national labs are working on de-energizing a line free fall. So the amount of real-time data and controls you need to do to be able to make that a reality is pretty sophisticated. But are there any other elements that are in that realm that you've come across that are interesting to you?
No, I think that we'll have to keep our eyes on how AI continues to advance a number of the different efforts that we're talking about now. I've heard anecdotally just employed in a lot of different ways, and in especially managing records and images, something that's been historically kind of hard to do. Just even digitally. So to have AI processing and that kind of stuff and be able to use it for preventative maintenance purposes and other things is pretty interesting. But what you mentioned sounds interesting too.
So PSPS, you've already brought it up, I don't know, 2 or 3 times. It's a new term in the vernacular of grid operators in the West and some other parts of the world. How much do you see public safety power shutoffs being used, or do you think more targeted solutions will be used, or is it going to be a combination of things? What sort of response do you have to how that gets used in the toolkit looking ahead?
Oh, definitely, used in combination with a suite of different mitigation measures. But I think it's safe to say this is a tool that's going to be employed more frequently going forward. And I say that because not every Western utility has a plan in place right now to do it, but a lot of them are working on it, right? So it's not something historically they've had the means to do, or even, going further back, the need to do, right? So now there's both the need and the means. And they're trying to get plans in place. It's reflective of both of those things. So I think that's something that is going to become certainly more of a reality going forward, and probably, seasonally and with luck in a limited way if the other technology is used effectively.
So maybe we can back ourselves up and talk a little bit about the context by which these activities are happening in business models and regulatory regimes. So my first question will be about kind of the utility, business model itself. Generally speaking, utilities make money from the capital investments that they then recoup over rates that are paid by their customers on usage. Are there elements of the utility business model that you see working well or not so well with regards to customers and threats, whether it's wildfire or other just resiliency related events on the electric grid?
Yeah, without getting into sort of an extended philosophical debate on like different structures in place from a regulatory standpoint. It's true that it's like, for the most part, the utility makes money on the large capital investments, expenses, whether that be inspections or maintenance or vegetation management, pass through costs that's recovered, but you don't profit on it. So one of the challenges for pretty much every utility is, how do you effectively balance the interests of shareholders and the interests of customers because a lot of the expenses that we're talking about have a direct bearing on safety. We're moving into a period in which we need more capital investment broadly, right? I mean, utilities are planning record capital investments in the system to prepare for electrification, to harden against the effects of climate change, to replace aging infrastructure. A lot of elements of the grid have been in place for, as long as a century in some cases. And so that's going to cost a lot of money. Those are necessary investments, but we're also in some places, utilities face real rate pressure, right? One way is that historically kind of kept rates down, given that expenses are also recoverable, is to minimize expenses, free up more money to invest as capital. And it's not to say that this is an impossible balance to strike, but it's hard. Yeah, it's difficult. And one of the issues that PG&E faced over the last decade was that it was minimizing our expense costs, specifically kind of maintenance and inspection costs, to the point where it was not fully aware of the risk throughout the system. And that proved to be really damaging, especially in the case of the Camp Fire. I mean, the Camp Fire of 2018 ignited when a hook on a century-old transmission tower broke nearly in half and dropped a live wire. I mean, the wear on that hook was visible for a very long time, but nobody saw it. And apparently. And so again, it's just challenging balance to strike. Every utility faces slightly different dynamics, but we're in a period in which it's going to be really critical to have regulatory oversight of spending on both sides.
So PG&E obviously made a goal of 10,000 miles to bury of their previously overhead lines. That's going to be no inexpensive feat. Who pays for these investments that we're going to use to harden our grid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do. The short answer is ratepayers do. And, PG&E it's a great example, because if you've ever wanted to justify a huge capital investment like that, right, burying 10,000 miles of wire to permanently reduce the risk of, or permanently almost eliminate the risk of fire in the areas in which the lines are underground, I mean, PG&E has a pretty strong case for it, right? It's they face great risk of fire in their service territory, but it's tough. It's like they have a lot of expense work to do in the interim, right? Whether that be with vegetation management or inspections and maintenance, and rates in California are very high. And there's been other issues, like, for example, like the extreme fluctuations that we've seen in natural gas prices have affected the cost of generation. And so kind of coming at all sides, it's hard to manage this. Oh, and then on top of that, just to make things even more complicated, the company sought bankruptcy protection after the 2017 and 2018 fires, and it didn't emerge financially healthier than it was going in. So it's somewhat constrained in its ability to raise debt and equity. And so just the financial challenges are very great. But so, yeah, here's the thing. It's not to sound like a broken record, but the role of the regulator is really interesting in all of this, as you see different utilities come in and propose very large capital spending plans, much of which are probably very necessary for whatever reason, whether that be safety or reliability or overall carbon reduction goals, right? But just making sure the right balance of spending is being recouped from customers at a time when electricity is getting more expensive. That's an important role to have.
Fantastic. So I want to go off on, I don't want to call them tangents, but some other kind of topics that are unfolding in the energy ecosystem. The first one will be kind of generally around equity. And when it comes to impact of maybe the most vulnerable in our communities, outages and wildfires, they can often hit those communities the hardest. How do stakeholders look to make sure that when they're making investments to improve resiliency or lower wildfire risk, that the folks that need to see those benefits the most are seeing those changes come to a reality?
Yeah, I think there's maybe a few ways to answer that question. I mean, for one, there's always kind of conversations about different rate structures, right, for kind of different tiers of customers. But I think there's also just talk about trying to deploy different solutions. And if you think about some remote rural towns in the Sierra foothills or wherever, there's more talk about having microgrids so that if there's reliability / safety decisions that need to be made, you're not compromising customers who might not have, be able to drive a few towns over and stay in a hotel or whatever. So things like that. And there's talk about how to expand access to backup power, how to expand access to solar plus storage, I guess means of kind of some distributed solutions that could help mitigate some of these challenges. And yeah, I mean, the financial piece of it can be difficult to solve, but there's some things that can be done.
All right. So the role of energy markets can't be understated, and the West is really working its way through what the future iteration of regional markets looks like. Do you think the topic of wildfire impacts and grid resiliency comes together with these discussions on next steps for regional markets?
Certainly to an extent, I do. I mean, I think that every regional market in the country right now is having basically a discussion about how to effectively manage the energy transition, how to effectively manage the integration of wind and solar and storage, and kind of what that means from a market design standpoint and ensuring reliability. That's kind of the foremost function of any kind of grid operator or RTO. I think that, there remains an evolving conversation in the West as to whether there needs to be some sort of West-wide market that would allow for a better transfer of power between states and just subregions. And to some extent, I don't know. If you see wildfires having a significant constraint on transmission or something somewhere, could that help? Probably. But I think that for the most part, the market discussion, at least today, is mostly centered on maintaining reliability and ensuring the greatest integration of renewables and the most effective integration.
Maybe my last of the kind of other topics will be around electrification. It certainly seems reasonably apparent that increased interest in electrified transportation is coming around the corner. That's going to make the collective us all more reliant on the electric system. What kind of impact do you think that trend has for wildfire risk, grid resiliency, and those topic areas?
Right. So, electricity demand in the U.S. is set to increase for the first time in a long time, partly as a result of this push toward electrification. And yeah, if you think about transitioning your mode of transport and your home, in some cases, to run entirely on electricity, that makes you very reliant on the system. And so what we're talking about here with issues with dealing with wildfire risk, to the extent any of this involves intentional outages, whether that be an outage resulting from a power line that tripped off on contact because the technology settings are such, or the proactive shut off seasonally when the winds pick up. If you don't have a means of powering your home through that event, it could present some significant challenges. So you are seeing greater increase in the various forms of backup power that you can have. To your earlier point about kind of equity and access, that remains something that we need to discuss collectively going forward.
Well, I know we only have a little bit more time, so maybe a couple more questions here. With the changing climate, it seems that threat from wildfires are certainly not slowing down or going away. What can the energy community and the partnering organizations that it can bring to the table really do to deal with the realities of these threats?
Yeah, so without discounting the fact that there's been growing recognition of these risks for some time, and there's been a lot greater engagement on behalf of companies and stakeholders. One thing that was certainly the case in reporting on PG&E, and also appears to potentially be the case with Hawaiian Electric, based on some recent reporting that I've done, is companies, not just PG&E, not just Hawaiian Electric, but a lot of utilities have been focused very much on helping to facilitate the energy transition and meeting ambitious carbon reduction targets, and seemingly less so on operational risk until it was too late. And that is, to be very clear, that's neither an indictment of renewables nor an assertion that a company can't do both at once, right? Utility companies have to do both at once to kind of focus on long-term carbon reduction efforts in terms of procuring more renewables per state mandates and other kind of reasons driving the energy transition forward, and make sure that there's commensurate resources dedicated to assessing what risks they need to address from an operational standpoint, right? What more could be done, for example, to address wildfire risk that's relevant in the West, or storm risk on the East Coast, or whatever the climate-driven operational risk may be. I think it's just sort of it's just utilities across the country should be asking themselves that question. Do they have resources on the energy transition side and the operational risk side? So that's my thought on that.
Well, I know it's somewhat difficult, but you've recently put a piece out in the journal about the Hawaiian fires. So, in general, while the recovery still unfolds and the looking into the causes is still undetermined, what are you starting to learn about from the Hawaii fires? Is there any reflections you have from the Maui disaster?
Yeah, yeah, and it's first of all, of course, it's extremely tragic, and acknowledging, of course, that we don't know for sure that power lines are implicated in this fire. It looks as though they might be, based on some of the early evidence that's come out. And if that is indeed the case, there's really some kind of eerie parallels with what happened with PG&E. But I think to put it at the highest level, it may be that the utility company kind of failed to recognize the extent to which wildfire risk was something that needed to be addressed very quickly. The company in 2019 came out with a kind of an announcement or a press release that said that they wanted to do more to address this, in part because they recognized growing risk on the islands and wanted to do more to assess what exactly that looked like. And part of it was because the company was observing what was happening in California. PG&E was going through bankruptcy. It was a hugely financially consequential event for that company. And they signaled that they wanted to get ahead of it. But the question is, might have already been behind. And so the company then hired a consultant to make some recommendations for fire risk mitigation, and ultimately filed with the commission a plan to address fire risk in 2022. As we know, the regulatory process is not resolved overnight. That proceeding is still ongoing. So they haven't gotten, permission to raise rates to recoup the costs of the investments they wanted to make that were specific to wildfire. So, it's kind of just an unfortunate reminder that this is a utility that, especially in hindsight, can appear to be moving slowly. The regulatory process can appear to move very slowly. I mean, this is all kind of after a disaster, right? Just a question of what more could be done? When did you know? It's a tough question to answer. And so, we'll be doing more reporting. So stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks for tracking it, and hopefully lessons will be learned and socialized. So our last question that we'll wrap up here really is around how do we manage this extreme risk? So managing a risk as extreme to wildfire threat to an entire community really requires so many people and places working and rowing in the same direction. How is there ways that we can encourage what I'll call maybe extreme collaboration in an area where there truly is extreme climate impacts?
Well, we're certainly beginning to see more. And I think that the short answer would be, I hope so. But in this particular space and addressing these particular challenges, there are indeed a lot of different stakeholders. And I'll just say that it can be hard to get everyone rowing in the same direction, depending on the nature of the challenge.
Well, Catherine, thanks for being on with us. Thanks for your reporting. For those who haven't, I don't know who in our community hasn't, but go get California Burning. It's a great resource. And Catherine, thanks for being on with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bryce Yonker here with Grid Forward. We have the special opportunity today to hear from a community member directly impacted by the recent Lahaina fires. Leanne Dreisen is with Trilogy Excursions. Leanne and I go way back. We're university friends, and they're one of the bigger employers in the community in Lahaina. So listen in as Leanne and I talk about their family and business's experience, kind of the firsthand account of what it's like to experience a fire as devastating as the one that their community has had. Please, if you're interested in donating, Grid Forward will be contributing to some of the recommendations that Leanne shares, and the notes will be in, the links for those organizations will be in the notes for our podcast. Leanne, thank you for being on with us. Leanne is a good friend of mine who I've known for a number of years, and her family runs the organization Trilogy Excursions. And Leanne, you're based in Lahaina, so thank you for taking some time to share your reflections on the recent activities.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for reaching out, and happy to be here. So our business, Trilogy Excursions, we are a family-owned and operated sailboat company. It was started 50 years ago. This is our 50th anniversary year, which is a wonderful milestone to celebrate. Something we actually celebrated in May. So really cool in terms of the timing of this disaster just happening, it was really fortunate that we were able to have that huge event back in May. Trilogy, like I said, it's a family-owned and operated company. It was started by my grandfather, father, and his immediate family, his brother, aunt, and mom, back in the early 70s. Originally, they're from Alaska. Long story short, my grandfather sunk his charter boat in Alaska, needed to rebuild a boat, asked my dad and uncle to help him do so. It took them 2 years to build. They built a sailing trimaran, which is a 3-hulled boat. And when that was finished, instead of going back into production, they decided to do a shakedown sail, took it from Alaska down San Francisco, and then basically just followed the coastline all the way through the South Pacific, the Galapagos Islands, and then eventually made their way to Hawaii, where they landed in Maui, on the island of Maui, and specifically in Lahaina. So they were established and rooted in Lahaina very quickly. That was in the early 70s. And then in July 5th, 1973, they started their first tour, taking 6 guests from the island of Maui out of Lahaina to the private island of Lanai. And that is now our flagship tour. So we've been doing that tour for 50 years. It's called the Discover Lanai Tour. And it's a all-day experience that we bring guests out with us and get to share with them kind of the slice of cruising life. They get to sail with us. All the food we serve has been in the family for generations. So fresh cinnamon rolls in the morning, fruit, coffee, hot chocolate, tea on the way over. And then once on the island, after the beach activities, we do a nice barbecue lunch at our pavilion overlooking the Manele Small Boat Harbor. And that's a teriyaki chicken. So it's a really cool family experience and something where I'm really proud to be a part of. And, over 50 years, we've developed an incredible reputation and just been able to sail with hundreds and thousands of guests from around the world and create lifelong memories with them.
Yep, I've been on a couple times. It's wonderful. You all have quite a few staff in the community, and it's family run. How many folks are with the organization there in the community?
We have 7 sailing catamarans, and we 2 out of Ma'alaya Boat Harbor, 3 out of Lahaina, and 2 that go off of the beach in Ka'anapali. But all of the Ka'anapali boats, they all live in Lahaina. So that's where they berth in the evening times. So we are predominantly a West Side operation. Our corporate office is in Lahaina. We employ 168 people. We have a catering facility as well. So our operations have grown. And yeah, we're super fortunate. We actually just brought in our 7th boat online earlier this year. So that was really cool to have that 7th boat with us.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing about all that. And I know that these will be hard, so just share whatever you're able to. So were you all prepared for something like what happened a couple weeks ago? I mean, I know there's been warnings and stuff, but did it come as a complete surprise, or what was it like to have that come all of a sudden onto the community?
Yes. The fires, what happened that afternoon, evening was completely unexpected. And obviously it resulted in a tremendous amount of life loss and a whole town being decimated. But in terms of what we were expecting, we followed the weather very closely. And so we knew that there was a hurricane that was coming, not a direct hit to the island. So we've been monitoring that. It wasn't looking like it was going to be terrible. So meaning that normally we would take our boats on like a storm watch if we know that there's going to be more of a direct hit or it was going to be wind-wise just a scarier situation or, thunder and rain and whatnot. So in terms of that, we had our operations pretty secure. We actually ran a trip that morning and the winds, we woke up that morning and the winds were already very, very strong. Power lines were already down. So we had no electricity when we woke up. The electricity went out around 4 a.m. that morning. And they canceled school, work. There was no internet, no power. So I took my car. I went to my office to grab my laptop. And on my way there, what normally would take me a 5-minute drive, it took me about 20 minutes to get to the office just that morning because of, again, no electricity. The road lights weren't working. And then at one point, I thought I was going to have a power line fall on my car. It was very scary. And I realized, I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, if a power line hits your car, I don't know what to do. So I learned what to do if a power line were to hit your car after the fact. And luckily, it didn't hit my car. But I did watch a string of power lines just like dominoes go down right in front of my face when I was waiting to get to my office. So all that to be said, people were very aware of the winds. They were, you could not be aware of them. And in that same light, people were inside and they had their windows shut and they were just, waiting out this very windy day. I ended up leaving Lahaina with my oldest son because I had a very busy work day and I needed to get on my computer. So I took him to go to my parents' house where they had electricity, and I was able to, start my work day out of Wailuku. And then, things just progressed. So I can definitely do a play-by-play or answer more specific questions, but in terms of the outcome of what happened, no one had that on their radar.
Yeah. And no recounting some of the devastation's hard. So I don't know if we necessarily need all play-by-play, but I understand the family did get out safely. Maybe you could share a little bit about that. And I was also interested to know maybe a little bit about the role that the boats had, because I understand you guys helped evacuate some people that were heading towards the ocean. So maybe you can recount a little bit of the evacuation, if you would call it that.
Gosh, so we were still I was in communication nonstop with our company president, who was in and out of Lahaina 3 times that day, and we were trying to figure out how quickly will these winds pass? Can we actually run trips tomorrow? Can we run trips the next day? So we were still just triaging logistics on our operations, on how we were going to keep business going. Again, not even thinking about a fire. At 4:00, I called my husband, and I wanted him to come to where I was because of the electricity. And I was like, let's just come to where I am. But he was like, the electricity will come back on, probably by the next day. You come home, we'll have a fun camp out. So I was like, okay, cool. So I was getting in my car, and I called again the company president, who I didn't realize he was back in Lahaina. And the first thing he said to me was, don't come to Lahaina. And I was like, oh, okay, why? He's like, roofs are flying off houses. It's crazy. It's so dangerous. Do not drive here. So I call up Mark, my husband, again, and I told him that. I'm like, hey, I don't feel comfortable driving. I hear it's really dangerous. Maybe I don't know what you guys should do. Should you stay, or should you try to face the danger and drive out to me? And at that point, he was like, there's a little fire that started. So he was aware of this fire starting. So we were in communication about that for the next about 30 minutes off and on. Around 5, I want to say it was 5 o'clock or 5:15. But the last conversation I had with him was the fires were getting closer. The firemen had come to our neighborhood and basically told everyone who was kind of congregating in our front yard to grab life jackets and towels, and if the fire were to get closer, to run to the beach. And that was my last conversation I had with my husband, before the lines totally fell off. And so he had my then 2-year-old, he was almost 3, but anyway, to be left with that lingering directive, and then not being able to hear from him for over 2 hours was just probably the hardest part for me personally that I had to go through, because in that time the fires had escalated to a very deathly level. And And so that was another problem. There was no communication coming out of the west side. So we lost communication with our company president. The last I heard from him, he had given his truck to a family that was trying to flee the harbor with no car. And he said, take my truck. Here's the directions to my house in Wailuku. Get out of here. And then he, while the harbor was on fire, swam across the harbor to jump on one of our boats to rescue it from the flames. And so he was able to navigate out of the harbor just using his gut instinct and a compass, because there was so much smoke he couldn't see. And that was a huge, very heroic, and also saved a boat of ours from complete damage and loss. So he was kind of our voice, because once he got out of the harbor, he was able to get cell service closer to the island of Lanai. And he relayed back to us just how extreme the fires were, that they had burnt the harbor, that they were taking over the entire Lahaina town. And so we were talking to our fleet manager. Luckily, most of our leadership team was out of Lahaina already or doesn't live in Lahaina. So we were talking on a big chat, and they said, we're going to meet at the harbor at Ma'alaia. Let's jump on some boats. We need to go out. We need to go back to Lahaina to see how we can help, and also to check in on our boats. Because again, we have, 5 of our 7 boats are based out of Lahaina. So around 10 p.m., a few of our captains, including my brother and my cousin, they jumped on our boat out of Ma'alaia, and with the Coast Guard, they went over to Lahaina and were able to be part of that first responder team. We were lucky. One of our captains, Captain Travis, he has a background in, he's an ex-fireman, first responder. He passed all the check marks in order to save people. So the Coast Guard allowed him to be a part of the actual rescue mission. So they paddled in on surfboards and basically were just trying to get people out of harm's way. So that effort that we were able to help 50 people with the Coast Guard, again, just getting people out of harm's way. But Travis did recount that there were a lot of lives lost that he saw. So it was horrific. I can't even imagine. I am hearing more and more stories that are coming out from that specific event, and also just people's stories who were waiting in the water, who didn't get rescued but made it out alive, but still, 10 hours treading water and whatnot. But that was our part in it. That's kind of, we were able to help those individuals, and then also rescue our boats. And then the next morning, we quickly mobilized and immediately got supplies out to Ka'anapali, and also picked people up who were stranded, who were trying to get back to family members. So we kind of did those efforts for the next 3 or 4 days, working with different organizations to deliver supplies and aid, and just being that round trip in and out, because the roads were still all closed.
Yeah. What a story. You all are clearly one of the leaders in the kind of the business community and the overall community. With that many people there, what kind of impact across family, friends, and the overall company have you guys felt?
I'm so proud of being from Maui. I'm so proud of our island. I'm proud of our company. I'm proud of the people who live here. It was an incredible thing to witness, the true aloha spirit, just rising up, instantly, just people dropping what they were doing to help. And it brings me to tears just how quickly our people, the people of Hawaii, rose up to do that together. I wish that we had more military help at that moment. It would have made a difference to have federal support quicker. But in the days that followed, just again, the community love that poured through was just beautiful. And also from, our guests that have sailed with us in the past, the outreach that they tons of emails just coming through, checking in on us, asking how they can help, even though they're not on island. What can they send boxes of clothes, food, like supplies? Like people just wanted to help, and so it was really encouraging. Even though we're still in a bleak situation, just again that outpouring has been so beautiful to be a part of and to witness.
Where do things go from here for Trilogy?
Oh man, lots of prayer. We need lots of prayer. Lahaina has a very long road of recovery. No one has that crystal ball, but the outlook, is 3 to 5 years for Lahaina town. And what that means for Trilogy is that's a big part of our operations. Again, is we depart out of Lahaina Harbor. So as a company, we are trying to keep our boats operating. We are trying to keep our employees on payroll. That's our biggest motivation, is just we don't want to see more families have to leave the island. So Maui is open, and that at first that narrative, was the opposite. People were saying, "Don't come to Maui, don't come to Maui," but we need people to come to Maui. So that narrative has changed, and Maui is open. Lahaina is closed. Lahaina will be closed for quite some time, but the rest of Maui is open, and we do need visitors to come here. The best way visitors can support a Maui business is by visiting. Their dollar, $4 out of $5, impacts a Hawaiian family. That is truly the best way that we can receive support right now, is again just having visitors keep their Maui vacation plans. Maybe it means you're not going to be staying, in Lahaina, because you can't. But there's other places on the island that are open that would receive you and would be a wonderful, wonderful place to be. And of course, sailing with Trilogy, we just trying to keep our boats sailing. So the more people we can come visit us, the better chance we have of staying in business.
Yeah. And you already covered the first part of this a little bit, but how can folks outside the community support Maui and Lahaina? And are there some good areas for donations to support the lengthy recovery?
There's a lot of organizations right now that are very that are focused on providing aid and relief to Lahaina community. A couple that we promote would be the Hawaii Community Fund, Maui United Way, the Lahaina Salvation Army. We've also we've partnered with GEM, Global Empowerment Movement. They are a nonprofit that goes into these cities or towns of distress and then basically mobilizes. So we've been partnering with them on raising money that will help aid direct victims of the fire. And we also start our own GoFundMe for our employees. A third of our employees lost housing. I was one of them. I did lose my house in that disaster. Luckily, I have family on island, which makes a huge difference, and I have a place to stay. But yeah, a third of our workforce lost their houses. So just trying to get them the direct aid that they need as soon as we can. So it's been, people have been so generous, and I continue to urge people to keep being generous in these different areas, because that money is really helping people.
Man, I really, really appreciate you taking some time to share your experiences. Thanks for being with us to share what it was like.
No problem. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for, again, reaching out. It's great having these deep and long friendships, and happy to share my story. There's thousands of stories out there, and we are just one of them. But again, proud to be Maui, Lahaina strong. Thanks for keeping us on your podcast and sharing our story with others.
Thanks again, Leanne, for sharing your experiences with the family and the community. We know it's been a really hard time that continues to unfold as so many people have been impacted there in the community. For our listeners, if you'd like to donate, please check out the notes of this session. There's some links for organizations that are on the ground trying to support recovery in Hawaii. Thanks for joining us in trying to do our part to help.